Welcome, Campfire Crew. Let's get it on. Gross Office Worker by Jenny Lynn. This story took place in an office building I used to work in. I was the receptionist at a cell phone company and basically made appointments for my general manager. Answered the main phone, all the typical stuff receptionists do. I don't think it's totally important, but I am a female, and I suppose you already guessed that by my name. I was 32 at the time, wife, 2 kids, and enjoying a fairly easy job. We had hired a new outside salesperson. I'll call him Kevin. He was by far the best candidate we had for the job, and I remember he had a very impressive resume. If you're wondering why a receptionist was looking at resumes, I was the one who had to go through all that stuff that had been mailed in before human resources took over. I suppose I was privileged to see all that stuff, and I guess you would say part of my job was for HR, and I was supposed to weed out applicants based on sales experience alone. I got pretty good at seeing who was a salesperson and who was clearly not. Kevin was hired, started, and immediately made an impact on our outside sales team. He was one of those above and beyond guys and also helped with our inside salespeople and even sat in on marketing meetings to discuss business and strategy. Everyone loved Kevin. He was a great worker. After just 3 months in, Kevin was named Employee of the Month, and at the end of each month we had a happy hour that my general manager would spring for. We would all go out to a local establishment for some fun and drinks, and we got to meet Kevin's fiancée, a very beautiful and capable woman herself, and everyone liked both of them very, very much. The next month, I started noticing that Kevin was staying much later than the rest of the folks in our office. Usually, I would arm the security system when I left, as also part of my responsibility. I had to secure the office as the last employee there, unless my boss or one of the other higher-ups was still in the building. They had the key code too. That happens sometimes, but most of the time people left by 5:30. So when I mentioned this to my boss, he said to give Kevin the code for the security system and not to wait any longer for him to finish any work he was doing. They didn't want me to miss out on my family time, and they trusted Kevin to just lock up the building and set the alarm. Not a problem. Whatever. Kevin was a good worker and they trusted him to lock up. No big deal. So after a couple of months, as I mentioned, Kevin was staying in our building later, more often. That's when my boss got a call from the headquarters of our company asking to set a meeting with their IT person. They also wanted our IT person in the meeting, and as the receptionist, I just set up the meeting and thought nothing more of it. 2 days later, the head IT person from headquarters showed up at our doors and said hello to me and made small talk for a few minutes. Then he said he needed to see my general manager, as they had set up a meeting without telling me. I later found out why. I just said certainly, called my boss, and he came out, they shook hands, and went back into his office. Shortly after that, Kevin came by my desk and leaned over on the front of my cube. We small-talked as well, and he said he was heading out on his calls. I wished him good luck and then got up for a cup of coffee. Then I just got back to my desk and went back to work. An hour later, my boss came out to talk to me and asked if I had seen Kevin, and I said yes, he'd gone out on his calls. He frowned and said, "Would you try to reach him on his cell phone?" I said sure, and dialed his number on speakerphone. It went straight to voicemail. Obviously my boss heard that. He frowned again and just said thanks. Went back to his office. Towards the end of the day, my boss came back again and asked how hard it would be to reset the alarm system for access. Now, I should be clear that there are 2 things about the security system we had back then. Everyone had a swipe card that could access the building during the day, but if the security system was on, say on the weekend or after hours, the swipe card wouldn't work. You would need the access code. I told him I would immediately look into it, and then kind of asked why, even though it wasn't my business. I assured my boss the security company might want to know. He said it was a precautionary measure and that we just needed it done. I agreed, made the call. Turns out it wasn't hard at all, and I came up with a new code that I would share with my boss. I walked back to his office and his door was closed, but I could hear him talking to the IT manager still, and someone else on the phone. I knocked on the door, went in, and shared the access code with the IT managers and my boss, and they just said, "Awesome, thanks so much," and that I could head out for the day. I said goodnight to everyone, got my things, and was headed towards the door when I saw a police officer and another man in a suit standing at our main door. I opened it and said, "Can I help you?" And they said yes, they needed to see my boss. I asked if he knew they were coming, and they said yes, so I walked them back to my boss's office. They all shook hands and then closed the door. The next day, I got to work, and my boss called me in and told me that Kevin was no longer with the company, and that under no circumstance was I to allow him in the building. I didn't ask why, and I said, "Oh, that's a shame. He was such a good guy, and I know everybody liked him." When I got back to my desk, I decided to clean up a little before I got to work, and I noticed a thumb drive on my desk that I hadn't noticed before. Honestly, I'd only found it because I was cleaning up my pen and pencil caddy and some post-it notes. I couldn't remember if it was mine, so I put it into my computer to see what was on it, and there were just a bunch of files with number titles. Just to be sure, I opened one up and it was a bunch of pictures, so I clicked on the first one and screamed out loud. It was a naked boy doing an unspeakable act to a much older man, and I immediately jumped up and ran to my boss's office, slammed his door open, slammed it shut, and he looked at me and said, "My God, you're white as a ghost, what's wrong?" I told him what I had just found, and he immediately jumped up, ran to my computer, clicked on another picture, and said, "We're getting a new computer for you. Take the morning off. Hey, take the rest of the day off." I asked him what was going on, and he said he would explain later. I was free to go and have a nice day off, and not think any more about this. He apologized for what I'd seen, but asked me to not tell anyone. I did as I was told, and when I got back the next day, I was called into his office with the IT managers and the headquarter manager as well. They asked me all about the thumb drive, and I told them it certainly was not mine, and I didn't know where it came from. Not long after that, the police in the form of detectives came into the office and asked me the same questions. IT stepped in at this point and said that the files had come from Kevin. They were pretty sure of that, and I told them that he had stopped by my desk the day before and had leaned over to talk with me. Everyone kind of nodded to one another, and I was brought into the conversation. Kevin had been trafficking child pornography for quite some time, and the police were onto him. He was using part of our system to share with people from all over the place, and that explained why he was staying late so much. It also explained why our IT department had noticed an uptick in bandwidth use, specifically from his computer. When our IT department looked on his computer, they found nothing because all of the pictures had been contained on thumb drives or other drives. I sat in horror listening to this and was appalled by that behavior. We figured out that Kevin knew he was in trouble and basically dropped the thumb drive at my computer to try to give the impression that someone was using my computer to do whatever it was he was up to, and maybe have an alibi. Yeah, smart thinking. Our IT people are a lot smarter than that. The police caught up with Kevin and found out that not only was he trafficking those photos, he was the person taking them. His fiancée had no idea. They raided his apartment and found hard drive after hard drive, thumb drive after thumb drive of tons of children naked. Everyone was sick to their stomachs, especially me. He was arrested, confined to his apartment until trial, and subsequently was convicted of child pornography and got a huge sentence. I'd have to go back and look it up, but I know he is not getting out for a long, long time. What a creep. Anyway, I felt so gross after just seeing that one picture, and it's still etched into my mind. It's so scary to know that you could be working right next to a predator, one who's abusing kids, and you would never even know it. That company is no longer in business, and I'm actually a salesperson at a different company. I'm not going to lie. Every time we get someone new in the building, I am reminded of Kevin, and I know it's unfair of me, but I always wonder who or what is walking through that door. Who Was Opening the Door by Priyanka S. Early in my career, I worked in a city in southern India for a while. I had just moved to this city, and I was having a hard time adjusting to its extremely slow pace of life, and the fact that I didn't really know the local language. Finding an apartment to rent was terribly difficult, and finally, after a lot of searching, I found a place. It was actually the large apartment of an old lady who lived all by herself and was open to giving me a room as a paying guest. It seemed like the best option since it was a safe community that she lived in. Her place was super nice and had all the amenities I needed. She spoke perfect English, so language wasn't an issue, and she was a highly educated lady. I enjoyed having conversations with her. Her husband had died over 20 years ago in an accident, and she had been alone ever since. Her kids lived abroad. About a year later, she suddenly took ill. She'd always been kind of fragile, but this time she got violent bouts of coughing, nausea, and random fevers. She stopped getting out of bed altogether at one point, and refused to be seen by any doctor. If I ever talked about taking her to the hospital, she would freak out, and this went on a while. Eventually, she called her daughter, and the daughter flew to India and moved her to a hospital. I found out a few days later that she had had breast cancer and that she'd had it for a few years. She had always known about it but had never told her kids, until now. She hadn't told me either. Basically nobody knew except the doctor who had diagnosed her. She had refused to take any treatment for it, and she just wanted to die since she had nothing to live for. At least that's how she felt. A few days later, I got home from work in the evening and found out that she had passed away. The body was in the center of the living room when I got home, covered in a white sheet, and some pundits were performing some rites. All of her relatives were there present, and her daughter had told me they'd perform her last rites the next morning. She also told me that I could continue to stay in the apartment and get a few flatmates if I wanted, and that she would be my new point of contact. After the old woman was gone, I moved into her room since it was a larger one with better light and ventilation. I didn't find any flatmates anytime soon, so I was alone in the house for a few months, and it used to rain a lot there, and the power would cut out so frequently that it just started to annoy the heck out of me. One evening, I came home from work during a power outage, and it lasted for over 2 hours, and I was alone in the house. I thought I'd just lie down on my bed and wait for the power to come back on so I could cook something to eat. But suddenly, I heard the bathroom door closing and the sliding lock being pulled shut. The bathroom lock was like one of those sliding rods that's attached to the inside of the door and slides into the frame, so it locks. I went to take a look, and the door was closed, and it was locked from the outside. The sliding rod had been pulled shut. I was 100% sure that door had been open earlier, but I decided not to overthink it and just tried to ignore it. After a while, I heard the lock slide open again, and I heard the door opening with a creaky sound. So I went out to the bathroom, and this time it was open, for sure. It couldn't have been the wind since every door and window in the house was shut. The rain was beating down hard, but honestly, it was not a windy day at all. Also, even if it was the wind can't really slide in and slide out this kind of lock. I was totally freaked out by this time, and I just opened the main door of the house and sat in the lobby till the power came back on. Couldn't sleep that whole night. I intensified my search for flatmates. I didn't want to be alone in that place for too long. Fortunately, a colleague of mine was leaving the organization, and her apartment was available for rent, so I grabbed the opportunity and moved into her place. I still don't know what that whole deal was with that door. Considering that this happened soon after the landlady had passed away, and it happened in her house, in her room, and that just made it all the more creepy. Scary Apartment Visit by Carmen L. I was single, had just graduated from college and accepted a job offer in a new city in the Midwestern United States. Back then there wasn't any Craigslist, Google, or apartment search type websites and ratings, so I checked the local newspaper ads for affordable rooms for rent, circled ones that sounded promising, price, utilities, on-site laundry, location, you know. I called the number listed, spoke with the landlords, and arranged visits for all of them. I had visited a few places, but was still considering my options when another ad stood out to me. 1 room available in a 6-bedroom house, good location, reasonable price, and residents would have full use of the gourmet kitchen and jacuzzi. I set up a visit one day in the middle of the afternoon, and when I arrived, I saw a tall steel fence around the perimeter of the yard. A man came out to unlock the gate. I could tell that he had some eyesight issues as his eyes were closed, or mostly closed, and he didn't make much eye contact. He had a lanyard hanging from his neck which was full of keys, and I didn't think much of it when I stepped into the yard, nor when he locked the gate with one of the keys. But after I entered the house, he locked the front door with another key and then removed it. I mean, who locks their own front door from the inside and doesn't leave the key in the keyhole? I felt uneasy, but he explained that he was completely blind, was very safety conscious, and didn't want strangers barging in. It seemed reasonable. He led me around the house, showing me the main rooms, feeling his way around the house with his bare feet, instinctively walking around furniture and through doorways. The gourmet kitchen that he, quote, built himself was splendid, with every pot, appliance, utensil that anybody could imagine. Upstairs, the master bathroom had a huge jacuzzi surrounded by sanded wood floors, also built by him. Some woodworking tools were lying on the floor as he was putting some finishing touches on the trim, and it was impressive. But the bathroom had no door. He said residents could use it any time, and since he was blind, he couldn't see anything, so don't worry. I grew more and more uneasy. We got to the basement room for rent, and it was basic. A bed, chest of drawers, and a closet. He said the rent was cheaper in the basement because the windows were so small and high. It was a glass block window at about the 7-foot height, and I already knew I didn't want to rent from him, but I decided to just stick it out and call him later. I was getting a bit clammy and nervous, thinking about the 2 locks. We were back on the 1st floor, and I saw a college-aged girl reading on the couch and said hi. She glanced up to acknowledge me and went back to reading. I asked the man whether all the residents had keys, too, and he said, "No, I have the keys. If you need to go out or come in, let me know and I'll unlock the door." What? From then on, I started praying. It got worse. No, this was way before cell phones, way before texting. I had nothing but my purse and keys with me. He mentioned in passing that he was a drummer and had built a soundproof garage out in the back and asked if I wanted to hear him play. I wanted to say no way, but couldn't think of a way to say so without sounding rude or scared. I decided if he was depending on this house looking attractive to a renter, he would rather keep the deal sweet for now. When we stopped just outside the garage door, I looked past him at the locked outer gate. I knew I couldn't get through it or scale it. I followed him into the soundproof garage, and then he locked the door from the inside with one of his other keys. The next 20 minutes, which felt like an eternity, I stood by the garage door while he pounded on his drum set till my ears were ringing and painful. The whole time I just prayed to God that it would end and I could get out alive. When he finally stopped, he asked what I thought. I just said, yeah, I guess I'm not really used to drums. My heart was racing. He let us out of the garage and even said that though the garage was soundproof, the police had to come to the house several times with noise complaints, which is why he keeps the outer gate locked. We walked towards Freedom in the outer gate, and he asked if I liked the place. In my sweetest voice, I said, "It's so beautiful, thank you for the tour. I have a few more appointments, but I'll definitely keep this in mind and let you know." He seemed satisfied and unlocked the gate, and as I walked to my car, I heard the sound of the gate locking behind me. I could not get out of his driveway fast enough. I've always regretted that I was too concerned for my own safety to ask the girl on the couch if she needed help. I could have slipped her a note, silently mouthed something, anything. But I wasn't really sure if that man was actually blind. My Great-Grandmother, submitted by William W. In 1970, my great-grandmother passed away. I was around 8, and I went to the wake. I wanted to say goodbye to her. So my sister, who was a few years older than me, took me up. I touched my great-grandmother's right hand with my right hand, and it felt like there was this white light just surrounding me. It seemed like I was standing there for over an hour. When I touched her, my sister wanted to pull my hand away and said, "You should never touch the dead." Well, my mom came up to see what was happening, and my sister told her that I had touched great-grandma. Well, you have to understand, my great-grandmother and I were very close, for I was the baby of the family. She only liked seeing me. I made her a white heart that said "I love you" on it the next day, and I wanted someone to put it in her grave. I couldn't go to that. Mom wouldn't let me and said I was too young, so my second oldest sister stayed home with me. Someone brought the heart to the funeral. That night I laid in bed, and, to my surprise, here comes great-grandma walking into my bedroom. She then took my right hand into hers and said to me, "This is why I was not able to go to the funeral." In seconds, where we were standing near the grave, I looked and saw my grandfather, Mom, and all my aunts and uncles crying, and said, "Why are they crying?" She told me they couldn't see her anymore. Well, standing there with my great-grandmother was my grandmother, who had passed 4 years after giving birth to my mom, and by them was my great-grandfather. Great-grandma then told them and me that it was time to go back. A second later I was back in my bed, and she told me everything was going to be all right. Then she walked out of the room, and I yelled out, "Don't go!" My mom rushed into my bedroom and asked what was going on, and I told her that great-grandma had just walked out of the bedroom, seconds before she came in. She had gotten the heart I made her. It said on the back, "I love you, great-grandma." My mother just smiled. Years passed by, and in 1994 I bought a house and moved in. One of my brothers was enlisted in the Army, and he came home for a class reunion, but I wasn't able to go, so I asked another brother to maybe take me out to see him. That wasn't possible, so I wrote to my brother that day and told him that because I wasn't able to see him, I won't be able to talk with him anymore. I don't know why I said that, but that's what I wrote. A few days later, my brother was found dead the day after his birthday. On the morning at 4 a.m. of the day they found him, great-grandma had come into my bedroom, and I woke up crying that one of my brothers was dead. At 6 a.m., my oldest sister called me to tell me, and I told her before she could get it out. I told her that I knew Steve had passed, and she asked how. And I reminded her that great-grandma comes to tell me. She did, and told me then. My dad passed after that, and my mom in 1999. Once more, my great-grandma came into my bedroom with her to say goodbye to me. I was up when the call came from my oldest sister, once again, to tell me that it was 6 a.m., and Mom had passed at 5, except she was already with my great-grandmother at 4:30 when I had seen them both. Once more, she asked me how I knew this, and I said to her, "Look, I've told you before. Great-grandma came to see me hours before, but usually it was just great-grandma. Then she told me about Steve, and then this time with Mom, she brought Mom along to say goodbye to me." That was the last time my great-grandmother ever came to see me. I'm wondering if one of the 7 of us pass, maybe she'll come to see me again to tell me before everyone else knows, or maybe she'll tell someone else that I'm gone. Lost in the Boundary Waters, submitted by Renee. This story happened in Minnesota, a high-adventure camp for Scouts area. One of our staff, I'll call him Dave for this story, had received a group of Scouts that came up for a 4.5-day trip. He helped the group to prep their equipment, showed the food, safety talk, map reading, and so on, something all trail staff does before we take groups out. I believe it was on day 2 or maybe 3 of his trip. They were looking for a portage trail. A portage trail, for those who don't know, is a trail that links 2 bodies of water, so they could get to another lake or river by carrying their equipment across it. This one trail in particular was difficult to find. so Dave decided to walk down what looked like a trail to see if it led to the next lake. First mistake, going alone and not using the buddy system. As Dave walked, he ended up tripping over a log or a rock and fell down a steep hill and hit his head. It rendered him unconscious, and he had a severe concussion. His group waited for a while and looked for Dave, but of course they couldn't find him. They attempted to use a marine radio to request for help, but they were out of range, so the whole group left to head where they had seen a ranger station earlier that day. Mistake number 2. They should have left one canoe with a few guys and supplies, while the other 2 canoes went for help. By the time the group made contact for help, at least 4 to 5 hours had passed, and everyone figures that during that time, Dave woke up with that concussion. He said he yelled for help, but there was no answer, so he just wandered off deeper into the bush. At one point, Dave realized that he was lost. Lucky for him, he had good survival skills, and for 3 days, he walked in the brush eating berries and, no kidding, eating ants. He would occasionally see search planes overhead, but they couldn't see him. He was wearing his life jacket that was black and blue. If he had worn an orange or maybe a bright yellow life jacket, they probably would have spotted him. On that 3rd day of being lost in the woods, Dave found himself at a lake and saw a group of canoeists, so he yelled for help and identified himself. But the group didn't believe him and initially refused to help him. I guess the group had heard about some convicts that escaped a prison that was kind of nearby, and they suspected that Dave might have been one of the escapees. Through a little bit of time and lots of frustration, Dave finally managed to convince them that he was a canoe guide, his official title was interpreter, and that he worked for the Northern Tier scout groups. They finally agreed to help him. We were so thrilled and relieved that Dave was found alive. Bruised, bitten by bugs, severely dehydrated, and a huge gash on his head, he was otherwise fine. So, boys and girls, please, when you go out into the wilderness, make sure you use the buddy system, and when you're on the water, wear a life jacket or PFD with bright colors. That way, if something does happen, a search party would be able to find you easily. What Happened to My Uncle, submitted by Jennifer M. This story happened in December of 2009 and took place in a small town in Oklahoma. I'm going to be changing the names for privacy reasons, but my uncle I'll call George, and my aunt, who I'll call Sally, both had issues with drug and alcohol most of their adult lives. Sally plays an important role later on, but most of the story is about Uncle George. George, as I said, had an issue with drugs and booze. And finally, in his late 40s, he cleaned up, changed his life around, and got married. His wife wasn't ever in very good health, and she had had a stroke which put her in the hospital and in a coma for about a month at the end of November. My Aunt Sally came up to see her brother George, and they ended up doing some drugs and drinking while driving around the back roads in Oklahoma. Anyone from Oklahoma knows that that used to be the thing to do. Well, after driving around loaded, they ended up wrecking the truck they were in. George, who was still drunk but okay, went to find help for Sally, who was curled up in the floorboards of the truck. It was very cold that night, so George went to find help, and a few miles up a road he found a house and started to beat on the door of the house, and the homeowner was home. Her husband was at work, so it was just her at home, and Uncle George was scaring her as he was beating on the door and walking around the house trying to get her attention. I'll refer to the homeowner as Patsy. Patsy called 911 and was on the phone with them as George was trying to get in the house. He finally broke into it, but he was shot and killed that night. Police later found my Aunt Sally in the truck suffering from hypothermia and barely alive. The police found the drugs and alcohol in the truck, and from what they gathered, they had been doing all that when they wrecked the truck. George went to find help and did it in all the wrong ways you could think of. Being intoxicated, he wasn't thinking straight, and that cost him his life. His wife came out of her coma to find out her husband had been killed, and my aunt woke up a week later to find out that her brother had died. Patsy now has to live with what my uncle put her through, and the nightmare of that night and what she did. It has forever changed the lives of everyone involved. So to everybody who's out there who thinks it's okay to get loaded and maybe drink and drive, think again, because you will change people's lives, and not for the better. My Scary Job as a Kid, submitted by Bazooka Joe 72. When I was 12, this would have been around 1984, I had a paper route that I did to make some money to blow on kid crap. Football cards, video games, the usual kid crap. It was the typical after-school job. We had a paper box on my front porch, and the delivery guy would drop off everything from my route and I would deliver. I lived in a subdivision and basically had to deliver on 5 or 6 streets, which was a big chunk of it. Back then, a lot of people used to get the newspaper, not like nowadays. And I remember walking around with that bag, and on Sundays it was super heavy with all the paper inserts I had to put in. I suppose that's irrelevant to the story. I'm just reminiscing. Sorry. So, I would walk around delivering my papers and collecting the fees once a week, or in some cases every other, or whatever. It was based on how those people paid. One elderly couple I delivered to always paid a month in advance, so most of the time I would just drop the paper off and would never really see them. That's kind of important to the story. I started delivering in the spring of that year and was enjoying it very much. That fall, I remember it starting to get dark on my route like it does every fall. This meant that a portion of my route I would do when the streetlights were coming on and the dark was really falling. Not like pitch black yet, but that early to late fall evening darkness. I lived in the northeast of the United States, so out here on the East Coast, it does get dark starting around 5:30 or so in the late fall, early winter months, for those of you not familiar with the area. Anyway, I remember one evening finishing up the street with the elderly couple that I was on before I headed home, and I recalled seeing a white pickup truck with a big cap on the back over the bed. It was driving very slowly down the street, and kind of stopped, but not really, when it got closer to me. The elderly couple's house was third to the last house I delivered to, and it had stopped up the street, and then as I went to the elderly couple's house, it had caught up and then slowed down. I didn't really think about it, as there were lots of people who lived in the neighborhood, and a lot of the streets were across and through streets. But I did make a mental note of it for whatever it was, just because they had slowed down by me. So I finished my route, went home, and that was it. It wasn't until maybe a week later that the same thing happened. The same pickup truck, same area of my route, same behavior. Stopping up the street and then slowly driving by me. This time I looked over at the driver, but by the time the truck did pass me, all I was doing was looking at the back of the truck. I mentioned it to my dad when I got home, and he said I was probably just being paranoid, but to keep an eye out. It was a very safe neighborhood, and he would always tell everyone, friends and family, about how all the kids in our neighborhood would run around until the streetlights came on, all year round, and how nothing bad ever really happened in our part of the suburbs. I can't blame him. It really was a safe place. I kept doing my route, and everything was going fine. I collected from the elderly couple like I always did, and it was the beginning of November. They gave me a Thanksgiving tip, which I thought was really cool because Thanksgiving wasn't for a few weeks. I do remember that about them. They always gave awesome tips around the holidays. I guess that dispels the myth that old people are cheap, laughing my ass off. That night on my way home after my last delivery, I noticed the white truck was now behind me and going in the opposite direction that I always saw it go. I stopped and pretended to tie my shoe because, for whatever reason, I thought I didn't want to know who was ever in that truck to know where I lived. I'm sure if they were really following me, they already knew where I lived. But as a 12-year-old kid, I had the stranger danger thing going and was trying to throw off the scent, so to speak. The truck went by me very slowly, and I looked up this time and saw 2 people in the cab of the pickup, but again couldn't identify them for the life of me. I was pretty sure it was a man and a woman, but again, I couldn't be positive. I told my dad, and this time he took it a little more seriously, and said that he would ask around in the neighborhood if anybody had noticed the truck or knew who it was. He told me that if it was one of our neighbors, he would have a talk with them and make sure that they knew they were scaring his son. I wasn't really scared, but my dad was a pretty protective guy. Although he didn't tell me at the time, nobody knew who was in the truck, and no one knew where it came from. 2 weeks later, I was making my deliveries, and at this point in the season, it was dark out at the end of my route. I was coming up to the elderly couple's door where I always left the papers, and noticed right away that something was up. They had a motion light over their garage, so when anyone walked up the driveway, the light came on. Tonight, it didn't. At first I thought, oh well, the lights are out, but went on with my delivery, no big deal. I'll never forget that was a Friday night because the delivery guy stopped me the next morning with my Saturday papers and told me that the elderly couple had put a hold on their delivery. He didn't say why, so I didn't deliver the Saturday and Sunday papers, but was back again on my Monday evening route walking by. I was passing by the elderly couple's house when the door opened, and from the darkness I heard a woman's voice call out, "Joe, where's our paper?" I stopped and thought for a moment, and remembered that they had stopped delivery. I stood there for a minute, and the voice called out again, "Joe, are you bringing us our paper?" I started walking up the driveway, and again the light didn't come on. Again I paused and called out the couple's last name, and the woman's voice again said, "Joe, please bring us our paper." I stood there and said, "I don't have any extras. The newspaper told me you put your deliveries on hold. I can go home and get my family's paper and bring it back if that's okay." There was a pause, but the woman's voice said, "Okay, that's fine, we'll wait." It sort of sounded like the woman who lived there, but I couldn't really be sure. But I also wanted to make sure that I was doing my job properly. So I finished with my last 2 houses, went to my house and got our paper, and without saying anything to my parents, ran back to the elderly couple's place. As soon as I got to their driveway, I noticed the white pickup truck was parked in front of their house with no one in it. I did think that was funny because I remember it was running because I could see the exhaust coming out in the cold air. As I walked up the driveway, again the lights didn't come on, but the front door did open, and a large man came out and started running towards me very fast. I didn't recognize him, and it took me a second to get my bearings before I turned and started running across the front lawns. I look back now, and I'm thankful the snow hadn't fallen yet because that would have been a really dumb move. Over my heavy breathing and terror, I heard the footsteps of the guy behind me. Then I heard the pickup truck start moving and come after me as well. As fast as I was as a 12-year-old, I made pretty good time getting back to my house and basically launched myself up the porch stairs, rolled across it, and then banged into our front door. My mom came out and asked what was going on as I cracked the glass on the front door with my foot, and obviously she heard the noise. I just yelled out, "There's some weird people after me!" And we both looked off our front porch and saw the man jump into the pickup truck with the woman who I believe was calling me for the paper was now at the wheel. They sped off. My mom picked up my leg and dragged me inside and called for my dad, and they immediately called the police after my mom said something very weird was happening and that she thought 2 people were after me. The police came out, and I had to tell them the story, and my dad made sure that I told them about all the times I had seen the white pickup. They went to the elderly couple's home, but there was no one there. Turns out they had gone on vacation, and that's why they had put a stop to their paper delivery. Whoever was in that white pickup had broken in, unscrewed the light, and pretended to be the elderly couple to lure me to the house. Police believed that whoever the couple was out to kidnap me, but they didn't tell me that. They told my parents. I was thankful because that would have terrified me even more than I already was. My dad started following me on my paper route in his car for the next couple of weeks, and I know that must have been a giant pain in the butt for him, but he was again just protecting me. We never found out who was in that truck, or what they really wanted, but when I was older my parents told me what the police had told them, and it makes perfect sense now. We really believed that some couple was trying to kidnap me on my paper route, and went to great lengths and took a long time to plan out their weird plot, and figured out when the elderly couple was not going to be home. At first, no one could contact the elderly couple because no one knew where they had gone, but when they did get home, they did tell everyone that they had gone on vacation. They reported that nothing had been taken from the house. A window had been broken in the back of the house, and the light was unscrewed on the front of the house, but that was it. Not long after that, I quit that paper route and got a job cleaning an office that my mom worked at. It was safer and actually paid a little more. Anyway, that's my story. It still freaks me out to this day. I have kids of my own now, and we see so much more of this stuff reported because of the 24-hour news cycle. As much as I like to think our neighborhood was safe, I'm starting to think that more stuff like this did happen when I was a kid. We just never heard about it. Everybody, be safe out there, and always be aware of your surroundings. Bad Luck with Guys, submitted by Dawn S. I've never had the best of luck with guys. I appear to have poor taste in dating. After separating for good from my kid's father after 5 years, I was ready to just be by myself. About 3 months of being a single mom, my neighbor approached me stating that a friend of theirs, Steve, would like to meet me. It didn't take long before he charmed his way into my life. The first 6 months were amazing. He began drinking more and more with his friends, and each time he would get extremely agitated and begin starting fights with random people. Slowly, our friends would stop coming around, knowing how Steve got when he drank. This, however, didn't stop him from drinking, but now all the anger was aimed at me. It took the next 6 to 8 months of build-up from name-calling and shoving to punching and choking. Suddenly, I knew I had to escape. However, the last time I escaped out of the bathroom window, he found me by beating up a friend of mine until he told me where to find me. Steve began stripping all of my clothes off when in his drunken rage, and laughing at me, challenging me to go ahead and escape naked. The last night of abuse was extremely scary. When I noticed how much Steve was drinking before he got drunk, I told him my son, who was 3 years old, wasn't feeling well, and that I was going to stay with him as he fell asleep. My plan was to stay the night in our son's room, pretending I simply fell asleep in there. At around 2:30 in the morning, I heard the bedroom door open. I lied there pretending to be asleep, and several seconds went by. I began holding my breath as tears started filling up in my eyes, and suddenly I felt his hand on top of my head. He grabbed my hair and yanked me out of bed, whispering in my ear, "Aren't you avoiding me?" Once in the living room, he threw me on the floor and then accused me of trying to leave him and demanded to know why. Before I could answer, he angrily said it was another man and then told me that he'd kill me along with any man I chose to be with. Threatening to kill me was new for him. He started that a couple of weeks before, and I'm assuming to put me in fear and make sure I never thought about leaving. Then, as he stripped all my clothes off, this time ripping them off, he said in a low voice, "I'm not going to kill you, but I am going to hurt you real bad." He punched and kicked me a couple of times before falling on the ground. He was obviously more drunk than normal. I started to crawl to my son's room, and he slowly crawled behind me, asking, "Where do you think you're going?" He stopped at the doorstep and said, "Lay down and go to sleep. Don't think about going anywhere." After about 30 minutes, it appeared he passed out on the doorstep of the bedroom. I decided this was my chance to leave. I put on an oversized shirt, picked up my son, and slowly stepped over him. He grabbed my ankle and said, "Where are you going?" I cried in fear and said I needed to get my son something to drink, and he angrily replied, "Hurry up." I entered the kitchen slowly, put my son down in front of me as I went to grab my purse and open the fridge at the same time when I heard him yell again, "Hurry up!" I picked up my son and ran out the front door with no pants on, no shoes, and no purse. I ran all the way to the police station, the whole time thinking he was right behind me. After hours, the way the police station is set up is you go into a room and push a button and talk to someone on an intercom. I ran in, put my back to the wall, and pushed the button behind me as I slowly slid down to a sitting position while holding my son in front of me, waiting for Steve to come through the door for me at any second. I thought for sure I was going to be beaten, but I didn't care because it would be on camera. On the intercom I heard, "How can I help you?" Then all I could do was cry. I couldn't even get any words out of my mouth. I didn't know how to explain. 2 policemen came out to assist me. A female officer took my son to get him food, and I went with a male officer to make a report as he gave me a blanket. After approximately 15 minutes, I heard Steve screaming my name as they brought him down the hallway. I held my breath as if he knew I was behind the door, and about 30 minutes later, the officer came back in with his sergeant. At first I thought they were going to tell me to go back home and collect what I could and get out while Steve was being held for domestic violence. But instead they questioned me more about his anger and if it was any different than previous fights. I explained I did feel more afraid, and then they showed me a list in Steve's handwriting detailing how to dismember a body and a good spot to bury a body without being found. This had lakes in our area along with wooded areas not used. He also had best possible dates written down with past dates crossed out. I felt like I couldn't breathe when reading this, and didn't realize tears were streaming down my face. I looked at the cop and asked, "What does this mean?" And he just simply stated, "That you're a lucky girl." Steve was charged with attempted murder and kidnapping, along with assault. I left back home to Arizona before the trial started, but gave a detailed statement before I left. Steve, of course, pled not guilty, but in the end received 2 years in prison. Approximately 2 months after sentencing, I received a letter from Steve simply saying, "It's not over. You'll always be mine." Hey gang, thought about doing something a little bit different when I do these longer volumes, and I'm going to start today. I'm going to go back into the archives and pick out stories I've never narrated, but I've heard other narrators do, that actually got me really interested in making my own channel. Throughout the video, you will see a GoFundMe listed at the bottom of the screen, and there is a direct link to the same GoFundMe page in the description below. It is a GoFundMe to take care of a really unique author in a time of need. Please check it out. And, without further ado, let's get it on. Dr. Ramsey by Sweet Mercy. A week or so before my 10th birthday, I walked to the corner store with a $5 bill and picked up a jar of ragu for my mom. On my way home, a man I'd never seen before fell in step with me and began talking. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "My name is Dr. Ramsey. I'm a pediatrician. Do you know what a pediatrician is?" I walked along silently, not replying, and fervently hoping he would take that as a sign he should leave me alone. Subtleties were not his strong suit, though, because he kept right on chattering. "Are your parents looking for a pediatrician for you? Of course, you're almost a big girl now. You'll be needing another kind of doctor soon, won't you? That's okay, though. They can still bring you to me until then. What's your name? You have beautiful hair. I was just on my way to get some suckers for the candy jar in my office. Do you like suckers?" Thankfully, we were nearing my house, so I ran forward, up the back steps and through the kitchen door. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of a very long, very scary ordeal. It didn't take long after that for Dr. Ramsey to begin showing up. At first, it seemed benign enough, at least to a kid. He would drive by nearly every day, smiling and waving. I told my mom, who said maybe he was just on his way home from work. But then, the phone calls began. My dad called me into the living room and sat me down. He asked about the day Dr. Ramsey followed me home, and if I talked to him. He said I wasn't in trouble, but that I needed to tell him the truth. I told him no, and he asked if I was sure. Could I be forgetting something? I told him no again, and he frowned. Then asked, "Then how does he know your name?" I didn't know. It turns out that was not all he knew, He knew my sister's name as well. Pretty soon, neither my sister or I were allowed to answer the phone. He called several times a day, and at first neither of us knew what he was saying. Then, one night, one of my brothers told us that he was telling my parents that he was going to hurt me, and later my sister. Things got complicated after that. My dad had called the police, but as this was before there were any stalking laws, there was not a lot they could do. They told my parents to call back if he tried anything. My dad then called a friend of his from back in the day who happened to be a cop. For the next month, my dad's friend escorted me to and from school. Suddenly, life as I knew it came to a screeching halt. I couldn't walk to school alone. I couldn't play outside. I couldn't walk to Super America. It's sort of like a 7-Eleven for those who don't know. When access to me was completely denied, things escalated. It was around this time he began threatening my sister as well. Then, one afternoon, my sister, two of my brothers, my mom and I were in the kitchen. One of my brothers saw a glimpse of someone in the garage. They'd seen him too. Dr. Ramsey came bolting out of the garage, my brothers chasing after him. They ran all the way to Cherokee Park, where he lost them in the trees. My parents called the police again, but nothing came of it. The only information they had was a description and a name that was almost certainly fake. A couple weeks later, we woke to find our dog hanging from the side porch. She was a gorgeous saddleback German Shepherd, born the same day I was. We were all devastated. The cops said there was no evidence it was him and ruled it accidental, but none of us believed that. His phone calls became more informative in the meantime. He would talk about who was home and who wasn't. If my brother would say my dad was home, he would tell him who was really in the house. He would also talk about the house itself, about the window in the kitchen he could easily open with a knife from the outside even when it was locked, and about the French doors that connected the living room to the side porch, and how the lock could be finagled from the outside if you jiggled it just right. That night, my dad put in some carpenter nails at the bottom of the French doors until he could get a new lock ordered. My parents had to go to a company event for my dad's work. My older brothers were at a Saints West roller skating rink, and my sister was on the phone with her best friend. My little brother was on the floor asleep. I was watching Devo on the midnight special with Wolfman Jack. It was late. Suddenly, the top of the French doors swung inward, and in the few milliseconds before the nails in the bottom caused them to snap back, I could see his silhouette. My sister whipped the phone at the television, and we ran upstairs. About halfway up, we realized our little brother was still asleep on the living room floor. So as quietly as we could, we slipped back down the stairs to get him. We all went into our bedroom and didn't turn on the light, and this way we could see outside. We watched out the window for a while, and when we didn't find him, we crept down the hall to our brother's room to look. We looked down and could see someone standing at the back door. He knocked loudly. "What do you want?" my sister asked out the window. He stepped back and said, "Is this the Mercy residence? I have a pizza for delivery. Can you come to the door?" She scoffed at him, declaring she was not stupid. She could see he didn't have a pizza, and she was calling the cops. He left. A short while later, my brothers returned home. We told them what happened, and they walked around the yard watching for him. They came back in and things settled down. By now, we'd pretty much given up calling the cops because it never helped. So we just went back in, each of us, except my youngest brother, who was still asleep, carrying a knife from the kitchen, just in case. Eventually, one of my brothers went into the kitchen to get a bowl of cereal as a snack. You know that sensation you get when you can just feel someone watching you? Yeah, he had that in spades. He kept looking around the kitchen, through the doorway, into the dining room, at the windows. He didn't see anything, but he could still feel eyes on him. So he went closer to the door to try to see better. The kitchen lights were reflecting on the windows of the door. It had 3 rows of 3 windows, so he still couldn't see. He stepped closer, and then closer again, until he was right up to the door, then cupped his hands on either side of his head so he could see. There, on the other side of the window pane, was Dr. Ramsey, smiling back at him. He turned to yell for my older brothers, and when he looked back again, he was gone. They went out again to look for him, but didn't see him. The next night we were at the table playing Crazy Eights, and my brother was restless. My sister asked him what was wrong, and he said he always felt like any minute now there would be a boom, boom, boom on a door or window. Almost immediately after he finished his sentence, boom, boom, boom on the window right behind him. In the chaos, the two eldest ran out, but he was already gone. A couple of weeks later, I was at school and we were outside on the playground during recess. I was swinging upside down when I saw that now familiar blue Ford Galaxy cruising by, moving slowly. There he was, smiling and waving. He called my name and I ran to the teacher and told her. The school had been told all about him, and she took me inside right away and called my mom. That same day, my mom had gotten a call from the school office asking her to verify that my dad was picking me up, as he'd called to say he was on his way. He wasn't. Not long after that, I woke up one night thirsty. I went down to the kitchen for a drink, and there, sitting alone in the dark, was my dad. On the table, a gun. He was tired of the police waiting until Dr. Ramsey tried something. He was tired of his children being terrorized. He was tired of being afraid every time he left for work that something would happen to us while he was gone. I sat with him for a time, watching, before he sent me back to bed. These events, and many more, took place over a period of around 18 months. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. He had vanished from our lives. The phone calls, the drive-by with the creepy waves, everything. For a long time, during and after the Dr. Ramsey days, I would have a recurring nightmare in which I would wake up to find him standing over me as I slept. It took a long time before I felt like a kid again. I found out years later that when he was calling, Dr. Ramsey would tell my parents that he was going to rape and kill me, and later my sister, and that there was nothing they could do about it. I don't know what happened to him when he disappeared. I don't know if he was in a car wreck, locked in prison, in a coma. But sometimes I wonder if the wait ended for my dad when he was sitting in that darkened kitchen one night. I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to. Hey gang, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you would like to hear your scary story narrated here, go to truescarystories.net and click on the submit button, or just directly email me, unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. And I'm also looking specifically for Halloween stories for our big Halloween extravaganza. If you'd like to support this channel, again, please visit truescarystories.net, click on the support button, and find out how you can help keep this channel commercial-free, or go directly to my Patreon page for more information. Please follow, like, and subscribe to this channel, and hit the little bell for notifications for every time I upload. And of course, follow me on social media. Links to that are in the description below. Looking to do a live campfire next week. If you haven't ever participated in that, it's your chance to tell your scary story live as we stream at around 9:30 on Thursday night. I'll have more information on that coming up shortly. Until then, everybody, be excellent to each other. And remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.